Hello, welcome to World Civilizations up to 1500. Now, we're starting session 3 of the 7th topic, Greece and Rome, the mother cultures of Europe. And now, in this session, we're going to be looking exclusively at Rome. So we can now turn to our lecture outline. So we can now proceed with looking at ancient Rome. Once again, this is another very, very important society and culture that is going to, in many cases, develop its own characteristics, separate and distinct from the Greeks. But at some point, as we'll see, the Romans are going to adopt many of the Greek values and characteristics, and they're going to disseminate those across Europe, as we'll see. So they're also going to be very important, not only in spreading Greek civilization, but also spreading civilization, period, across Europe, one of the great civilizers, if you will, of the European continent during this time. So let's look at the rise of Rome, the city of Rome. We're going to look at the very early origins of that city and the different phases of development that city went through, as we'll see, leading up to the Roman Empire. So we're going to conclude this discussion with the Roman Empire and its downfall eventually in 455 AD. So before we move into the creation or the origins of Rome, it is also very important to look at the geography of the Italian peninsula. Just like we looked at the Greek world, how the geography influenced the development of, for example, individualism and small states because of the mountainous terrain of that region. We're going to look at here in the Italian peninsula also a very particular, very distinct geography that is also going to shape the way that Roman civilization is going to develop as well. So the geography really provides the conditions for certain societies to take on certain characteristics, again, that will become part of their worldview, part of their political, economic, social world as well. So when you look at the Italian peninsula, we're also looking at a very mountainous topography as well. This is not to say that this is identical to the Greek geography. Again, is different in so many regards. It has, of course, mountains, but as you can see, there are two set of mountains in the Italian peninsula. One to the north, again, this is known as the Alps. Again, just right here to the north. Again, this is called the Alps, the mountains. Again, and to the very middle of the Italian peninsula, there's also a mountain range, as you can see, just down the middle of the Italian peninsula. Those are the Apennine Mountains, okay? So the Alps to the north and the Apennine Mountains that run across the very middle of the Italian peninsula. Now, what those mountains are going to be significant for in the development of Roman civilization is that on one hand, for example, when you look at the Alps to the north, this is going to provide a kind of protection, if you will, to the Romans, at least for its very initial phases of development. They're going to be insulated, so to speak, from the rest of Europe. So the mountains serve like a natural barrier, if you will, for all the nomadic groups and tribal societies that were scattered across Europe. They're going to, for a time, be deterred from actually launching a large-scale invasion into the city of Rome, just because of this protection again. Eventually, as we'll see, once Roman civilization flourished and expanded, and the nomadic, so-called barbaric tribes of Central Europe also grew and expanded, of course, they're going to start raiding and invading Rome. I mean, this is something we're going to get to see at the very end of this discussion. But for a long period of time, Rome was insulated and protected from foreign invasions. This is something similar to what happened in Egypt. You know, when we looked at the Egyptian geography as well, it was insulated from all sides. So we see a long continuity in Egypt of civilization, uninterrupted in many cases, with very brief periods, of course, of minor interruptions, but there's a long historical continuity, political, religious continuity. Likewise, we see something similar occurring here in the Italian peninsula. There's going to be a prolonged continuity of Roman customs and Roman society, and the expansion of Rome will be due precisely due to this protection. Now, the Apennine Mountains that run across the middle of the Italian peninsula from north to south, it is also significant to look at, because what those mountains are creating in the development of Roman civilization is that this is forcing people to live on the coastline, very similar to what happened in Greece. Again, and Greece is full of mountains, and so people were forced to be closer to the sea, so to speak. This is where you find the valleys, for example, for farmlands, and the settlements are going to be flourishing along the coastlines. So this is another very important characteristic, is that the communities that will flourish in the Italian peninsula, for example, like Rome and others, are going to be closer to the sea. And there's also going to be a tendency, so to speak, to look at the sea as well. At some point, Rome is going to look at the sea at some point. Initially, it was not really centered on that, but as Rome grew, it expanded also into the Mediterranean Ocean as well, just like the Greeks. Okay, so that's as far as the geography is concerned. Now, another aspect of the geography is that when you look at the Italian peninsula, it is really, for example, when you look at the Mediterranean world, the Mediterranean Sea, the Italian peninsula stands right there at the very middle of the entire Mediterranean Sea. It is really situated in the very center of it. So it positions, in this case, the Romans to be really at the very center of a world, so to speak, which was the Mediterranean world. And so this is going to give them an advantage, an edge over all the other societies scattered across the Mediterranean Ocean. Again, they're in the very, very middle. And when you look at the city of Rome as well, this is the city of Rome. Rome is also situated in the very middle of the peninsula as well. So the Romans who built the city are also going to have an edge over all of the societies that were scattered across the coastline, and they're going to have a kind of an easy task of conquering the populations north and south. They're going to be expanding in both directions at once. So once again, Rome, the city, is situated in the very middle of the peninsula, and also the Italian peninsula at the same time is in the very middle of the Mediterranean Sea, or the Mediterranean world. And this was really the ideal location to build a very large imperial system along the Mediterranean Ocean. Again, so as you can see, this is going to be the map of the European, Roman, in this case, Roman Empire in Europe. Okay, at the height of the Roman Empire, as you can see, they conquered great portions of Europe, the Iberian Peninsula, what is today France, was called Gaul during that time. Britain was also conquered, parts of Central Europe, Eastern Europe, including the Eastern Mediterranean, North Africa. All of this, again, was once upon a time part of the Roman Empire. And one of the reasons why the Romans were able to control and expand across these regions because of the geography. Again, they were really situated in the very, very center of it, okay, in the very middle of that. Okay, so geography really, in many cases, determines the fate, the destiny, the course of civilizations. Now, in terms of the demographics, when we look at the Italian peninsula itself, we see, of course, that this is a region that was settled by a number of Indo-European groups that migrated from the Caucasus Mountains. We discussed that very early on in the semester, of course. I'm just here reminding you that the Indo-European migration out of the Caucasus Mountains, again, took place all over Europe. There were so many groups that migrated to different areas. Again, some of them migrated to what is called Greece. We looked at that, the Mycenaeans, for example. And others continued their march into this region. And as you recall, the Indo-Europeans, these are warrior societies. Their class structure is that they have elected monarchies, and there's an assembly of elders, a council of elders that often elect the kings. And at the bottom, of course, there's a group of warriors, who share equal rights and privileges, So the Indo-Europeans that settled in the Italian peninsula were no different. They're going to bring their warlike society and culture, and they're going to also elevate the warrior to divine status. The heroes of their society were all warriors, just like the Greeks, as we looked at, for example, the Mycenaeans, the story of the Iliad and the Odyssey, Achilles, and so on. It was really the military hero, the warrior that was really the superhuman, the savior of society, the savior of civilization. Now, in the Italian peninsula, however, despite the fact that the warriors play a critical role and they occupy a central place in society, well, it is really the patriarchs that the Romans called the patricians. Those were really the father figures of the clans that are going to be dominant, even more so than their monarchs. Remember that the Indo-Europeans, although they have kings, the kings are not absolute rulers. They're elected, and they can be deposed from time to time, as they were. But here, as we'll see, in this society are the patriarchs, really the clan leaders, the father figures who are the heads of the clans. They're going to be pretty much in control of the society on almost every level. Okay, the patriarchs. Again, keep that in mind, because this is going to help explain some of the political formations of the ancient Romans, how they're going to structure their government, for example. The patriarchs or the patricians playing a key role, for example, in the state. Okay, so it all started back again in the early migrations of the Indo-Europeans into this region. Now, of course, there's a great number of different ethnic groups that came to occupy the Italian peninsula. There's a great many of them. One of the major ones, again, those are not the only ones by any means. I'm just naming here perhaps the most important ones that occupied different areas and seized control of certain regions and created their distinct societies there and cultures. For example, were the Etruscans. The Etruscans, again, are perhaps before the rise of Rome, the Etruscans were really the most important group, the most dominant group of the Italian peninsula. As you can see, they occupy the northern region, and they form a confederation. I think this is really an alliance of different tribal groups. They were not really an empire. Okay, it was just an alliance of tribal groups. They cooperated with one another. Sometimes they waged war from time to time, but they share a common language, a common culture, common traditions, the Etruscans. The other group were the Sabines, as they were called. The Sabines, again, those were really peoples that inhabited this region, as you can see. That is going to be just to the east of where Rome is going to be located. Again, those are going to be also very, very important, as we'll see, in the creation of Rome, the Sabines, the Sabines. The other groups were groups that arrived a little late, so to speak, than the Etruscans and the Sabines, because the Etruscans and the Sabines, arrived there around 2000 BC, very, very early on in the development of this, the Indo-European migrations. The Greeks and the Phoenicians are coming from the Eastern Mediterranean, and they're going to be arriving there around 750 BC. Okay, we looked at that. The Athenian expansion, the colonization of the Mediterranean world. That was part of that process. Okay, the Greeks are navigating, the Athenians, they're colonizing different areas. Some of them are going to build colonies in the southern tip of the Italian peninsula, and also building colonies in the island of Sicily as well. The Phoenicians are engaged in this same process as well of establishing different trading outposts and colonies in different areas of the Mediterranean world, including Sicily, parts of Spain, for example, and North Africa. It's also going to be another region where the Phoenicians, which was really a merchant or mercantile culture and society from the Eastern Mediterranean, they're also involved in this process of colonizing the Mediterranean world, and they're going to build colonies as well in this region, as you can see. All right. So this is, in very general terms, the demographics, so to speak, before we get to see the arrival of the Romans. We're going to get to see that in just a few moments. As you can see, the Greek and Phoenician colonies. It tells you the ones in green are the Greek colonies, for example, here in southern Italy, in what is today southern France, or Gaul, as it was called. The Iberian Peninsula is going to be colonized by Greek and also Phoenician. North Africa by the Phoenicians as well. You can see that there's this process of colonization taking place. So it is in this context where we're going to see the origins of the Romans taking place. Roughly speaking, this is something that it all depends what kind of sources we're going to be using here. There are two sources available to us to reconstruct the beginning of Rome, or the early Romans in the Italian peninsula. And again, we're talking about the very, very early origins. Again, in this case, the very, very early formation of the Roman city and the inhabitants that actually formed it. And the sources that are available are archaeology and mythology. Again, there's really archaeological records available to us, like graveyards, for example, that have been studied by archaeologists. They're carbon dated, and we get to more or less determine when were the first settlers arriving to this region where they build Rome. And of course, the myths, the mythologies that later on the Romans, much, much later, once the city was established and they had writing systems and the like, of course, they wrote myths and legends about the formation of the city of Rome. And this really, again, it's just legends and myths for the most part. Again, so those are the two sources that are given to us to pretty much reconstruct the beginning of Rome. So from the archaeological record, we know that the ethnic group that came to this region, again, it is estimated that they're arriving, give and take, around the year 1000 BC to this region. Again, the early presence of the settlers of this region arrive about 1000 BC, and they were known as the Latins. Again, Latins. So it's a linguistic group. It's Indo-European, and they speak Latin. So therefore, this is the name of the ethnic group. It's an ethno-linguistic group. And they're going to inhabit this region. They're going to be hunting and gathering, but also engaging in early farming practices, fishing, for example. And this region will be simply known as Latium. Okay, Latium, just like the Etruscans, to the north. This is also another linguistic group that form a confederation. They're all speaking the same language, the Etruscans. Well, here we see that the Latins as a whole, because they share a common history, common language and traditions, again, they're building what is called Latium. Again, the early origins, again, of the Romans. So those are really the forerunners of the Romans, so to speak, okay, as you can see here in this map. So as I said, the early occupation of the city of Rome goes back to 1000 BC, and that has to do with remains of bones, for example, graveyards, burial sites, and the like. So we see the early presence of the Latins again in this region at that time. So that's from the archaeological record. That's what we get from that record. Now, in terms of the mythology, once again, those are actually legends and stories and myths that later on the Romans wrote regarding the origins of their city. So some of those myths were given to them by oral tradition, but at the same time, the authors of those myths mixed a lot of ideas from the Greek world. Okay, so they really mixed Greek myths with Roman myths. The idea was to use those myths not necessarily as history, but as propaganda, to exalt and elevate pretty much Rome to a new status, that this was a civilization that was deeply connected to the Greeks, because by the time that those myths were written, the Romans had already came into contact with the Greeks, adopted many of their customs, their literature, their religion, and they were fascinated about the Greek civilization. So they were trying to associate themselves with the Greeks. And also they were trying to legitimize, their own civilization as well, to exalt it, So there are three legends in particular that were written much, much later in Roman history that talk about the origins of Rome. One of them was called the Aeneas story. The Aeneas story, it is a story that links the origin of the city of Rome with the Mycenaean civilization. The Iliad, the epic poem of Homer that talks about the Mycenaeans, how they waged war against the city of Troy and destroyed it and burned it to the ground, etc. The age of Achilles, for example. Well, Aeneas was supposed to be a Trojan from the city of Troy that escaped the destruction of the city. Again, this is a myth that Aeneas, once again, lived in Troy, and when the city was destroyed by the Greeks, that he escaped on a boat, and he sailed along the Mediterranean Ocean, and eventually he ended up on the shores of Italy, the Italian peninsula, and he's going to be the founder, again, of the Latins. He's going to be one of the founders of the Latins, and also one of the forerunners of the city of Rome as well. Not necessarily the founder, but he is one of the first inhabitants, one of the first settlers that arrives from this epic golden period of Greek civilization to really start a whole new civilization that will ultimately end up with the emergence of Rome. Okay, so again, it is mythological. Again, we don't have a historical data to back it up. Again, this is just myth. Okay, the other legend that is central to the formation of Rome, and that this is one of the myths that many Romans took as historical. I mean, they didn't even question whether this was actually mythology or reality for them. It was real for them. Is the story of a set of twins. Again, those are twin brothers, Romulus and Remo, as they were called. Again, those are Latins, again, that lived in this region. It's called Latium. This is way before the city of Rome was built. According to the legend, Romulus and Remo were born from a mother who made it with the god of war, Mars. Okay, the god of Mars was the father of those twins. Now, the story really started out as, a little society that had a king, and the brother of that king overthrew that king and installed himself in power. Okay, so to prevent the family of his brother from seizing power once again, he ended up killing the son of his brother And the daughter, he imprisoned the daughter and made her become a virgin, a vestal virgin, in other words, that will have absolutely no relationship with anybody. So she will not bear offspring, because he didn't want any offspring to challenge him later on in life in the throne, for example. So that vestal virgin was the one that, according to the myth, made it with the god of war, Mars, and had twins, Romulus and Remo. And so the king, the uncle, actually came in and banished, of course, the twins. The twins were put on a basket. He threw the twins on the river, so they can be carried away and die, for example. Okay, so the twin brothers ended up going into a location. They were swept away by the water. They ended up being rescued by a wolf, a she-wolf in this case, and the she-wolf took care of the twins for a number of years, presumably. She was nurturing them, etc., taking care of them, until the shepherd found them in the wilderness, picked them up, adopted them, and raised them until adult age. Of course, later on in life, the twin brothers learned the truth of what happened, to the mother and so on, and they came back to that village and actually killed the grand uncle again, killed him, and pretty much restore power there. Their grandfather was once again put back in power. So the twin brothers decided to return to the place where the she-wolf had rescued them, and they decided to build a city there. Okay, they decided to build a city. And this is the beginning of Rome. They decided to build a city in the spot where the wolf had actually rescued them again for a number of years that were taken care of by the wolf. Now, the wolf, of course, in Roman mythology is considered to be the totem of the god of war, Mars, as well. So there's a close association, again, with the god of war here. So at some point, they entered a dispute over who was going to be the king of the city, and they started fighting with one another, and eventually Romulus ended up killing his twin brother, Remo. Okay, so the beginning, once again, of the city of Rome started with fratricide, the killing of one brother by the other over power. So it was a myth that is going to perhaps foreshadow the kind of political relationships of the Roman rulers and emperors much, much later, in which there will be a constant fighting over power, and they're going to be even killing each other, members of the same family, over the throne or over power in general. So now that he is the king, now he really needs to settle the area. There were no people there. Okay, so he needs to now invite people to live in his newly found domain, and he's the king now. So he pretty much invites all the outcasts, all the people that had been exiled from the different settlements and villages that were wandering, in the wilderness. Those were actually thieves and murderers, for example, and so on. They're all going to be invited, to live in Rome. So Romulus actually awards lands to all of those settlers, give them land to live there so they can settle and build the city. By the way, the name Romulus, again, is where the name Rome comes from, again, from Romulus, again. So now there's only men living there, and they needed women. Of course, there's no women, so how are they going to actually multiply? So they needed women, and they invited then the neighboring villages and communities to marry their daughters to the settlers of the city. So they went into the villages and they presented themselves and they said, we would like to marry your daughter, and so on and so forth. And of course, nobody wanted to get married to those guys because, once again, those individuals have been expelled by those villagers, because they committed atrocities or crimes, in those communities. So nobody wanted to make any links or connections with them. So The solution to this gave rise to yet another myth, and that is the myth of the rape of the Sabine women. Those were the Sabine tribes, that we mentioned, the Sabines, So what Romulus and his peers did was to invite the neighboring tribes, the Sabines, to a party. Now, we're going to throw a party and we'd like to invite you, bring your family, bring everybody. There's going to be plenty of food, drink, etc. A big party, a big feast. So when everybody was present and the feast began, they encircled everybody. They encircled all the attendees, and they pretty much took hold of the young ladies and conducted what is called a massive, massive atrocity there, what is called the rape of the Sabine women, in order to bear offspring, in other words. Okay. Eventually, they marry those women by force. They force those women to come and live with them in the city. And this is, once again, another very peculiar origin of the city of Rome. We already mentioned that one of the peculiar characteristics of the origins of Rome was fratricide, the killing of one brother, and for power. And the other peculiar characteristic, again, is the raping, again, of the women as well. So it also, in a certain sense, started, with rape as well. So again, those were myths written by the Romans themselves. Okay, so those are not myths written by the enemies of Rome, by the critics and so on. Those are the Romans actually writing this, again, to kind of explain how the city got started, and they were rather exalted and proud, to actually advertise those ideas to the citizens of Rome and also to the other provinces that they eventually governed. Again, so it's quite, peculiar way of framing the origins of a society that, again, you're pretty much putting at the center the origins of your group, the origins of your city and civilization in terms of fratricide, rape, and of course the god of war, the god Mars as well. They're all present, in those myths. Okay, so at any rate, now that the city is formed, now we're going to get to see the different phases of development that the city of Rome went through. And in general terms, there were three main phases of development, okay, that the city of Rome went through. The very first was the monarchy. Okay, it spanned from 754 all the way to 509. So presumably, the incident of the founding of the city of Rome, when Romulus actually killed his brother and invited the criminals to live with him, and the rape of the Sabine women and so on, presumably that took place in the 750s BC. By 754, the city is already formed, and we see the very first monarchy being elected. Okay, the first monarchy. And Rome, initially, the city of Rome, is going to be ruled by a series of kings from 754 all the way to 509 BC. Now, the way that the monarchy was established is that because the fathers of the women that were raped, the Sabine women, waged war against Romulus and his peers, there was a series of wars between the Sabines and the Latins, again, that spanned for a few months. Eventually, the women intervened and stopped the war and kind of invited the two parties to make a peace alliance, a peace treaty. Okay? And in the peace treaty, the agreement was that the city was to be ruled by two kings. Okay? One will be Latin and the other one will be a Sabine king. Okay? So Romulus actually established a dual monarchy, or what is called a dual magistrate. Okay? It's co-rulership, one Roman, and Romulus becomes the first king, but he's also ruling along the Sabine king as well. They're both actually ruling the city. So he had a dual monarchy. Again, kind of peculiar way of arrangement as well. But keep that in mind, because that dual magistrate is going to remain pretty much constant throughout and across Roman history, all the way even to the time of the Roman Empire, as we'll see. Just keep that in mind. Okay, this co-rulership. Now, below the dual monarchy will be a senate. Again, this is a senate is created, and those are the patricians. We talked about the patricians, the Indo-Europeans, the Latins that come into this region. They bring this council of elders. They are the patriarchs. They're known as the patricians, and they're going to serve in the Senate. This is a law-making body, so to speak. They are making the laws, writing the legislation, and so on, making the rules, making decisions, if you will. And of course, the kings are on top, leading the way as well, executing the law. Okay. Now, during this period of time, there will be certain rulers that also created, for example, the office of the chief priest. One of those rulers was Numa Pompilius, for example. Numa Pompilius, who was himself a king, he also created a new office in which what he determined is that the emperors themselves are not only going to carry out political functions, they're also going to exercise as well religious functions as well. They're going to be the chief priest as well. So again, we see very early on during this period of time a mixture of politics and religion. They're going to be somewhat inseparable, to the point that from this point onwards, the rulers are going to acquire a kind of divine status. At least they claim divine origin. Remember, they're claiming divine origins, at least from Mars. The god of Mars, again, is their co-founder. This is the father of the twins, for example. So the institution of the monarchy started with the god of war. So again, they are acquiring certain divine characteristics. Now, at some point, the city is going to be ruled by foreign kings, the Etruscans. The Etruscan kings, who are far more powerful than the Romans, are going to dominate them and install actually rulers. Again, so Rome will be ruled by foreign kings, and they're Etruscans. So during this period of time, because they're ruled by this foreign power to the north, the Romans are going to acquire many of the cultural characteristics of the Etruscans. Again, so the Roman culture is not developing in perfect isolation from the rest of the peninsula. The Etruscans are exerting significant influence on them. For example, the gladiator games. This is something that the Etruscans were accustomed to do. It was actually a ritual that they performed. It was a ritual related to the death and burial of warriors. Often, when a warrior was buried, that was in the honor of the warrior. There will be gladiators that will be conducting games, blood games and so on. Also, divination. It's called God-gazing divination, actually opening an animal, sacrificing an animal, and opening the guts and examining the guts. And by examining the guts, the priest will actually look at the future, for example. This is a custom that pretty much remained in Roman culture across not only hundreds of years, but even thousands of years. Again, this is going to be a kind of a so-called pagan custom that many Romans and later on Italians actually continue to do. It comes from the Etruscans. Now, at some point, the Romans are going to rebel against the Etruscan kings, and they're going to overthrow them. And with that, they're going to put an end to the monarchy, so to speak, as we'll see. And that came, in the form of revolting against an Etruscan king. His name was Tranquinius Superbus. He was really the seventh king of Rome. He was Etruscan. He was a very, very arrogant individual, full of hubris as well. He committed, several atrocities. He will actually disrespect people, and at some point, he actually raped a woman. One of the most respected families, of Rome, was actually aggravated by the king because he ended up raping one of the women there again. So in retaliation, one of the family members, his name was Brutus, led a rebellion against Tarquinius. was his name. And Brutus was successful in ousting this Etruscan king, repelling his forces and freeing Rome from this foreign domination, and eventually freeing Rome from monarchs, from kings again. So this really was the end of the monarchy in Rome. So with the end of the monarchy, we're going to see another time period in Rome, otherwise known as the Republic. Again, this started out around 509 BC. So Rome is going through a change now. Okay, it's no longer a monarchy. They're going to introduce a new political system, a new constitution that was a mixed constitution. It's almost like a mixed form of government that mixed an aristocratic form of government with democratic form of government. Okay, so it had both aristocratic and also democratic elements blended into one, the Roman Republic. So again, this is not like Athens, where we have a democratic society implemented there in which people were ruling the city directly. Yeah, there's still the aristocracy, the patricians are still pretty much in control. For example, at the very top of the Republic, we have two councils. Again, they're not kings. They resemble like the two kings of the monarchy that we talked about, the dual monarchy, but they're no longer kings. They're not absolute rulers. They are actually individuals, patricians, that served in the Senate. Okay, so there is a Senate. The patricians are still controlling the Senate. They write the laws. And after serving a period of time in the Senate, two individuals are selected from time to time to rule the council, in other words. It's almost like two presidents, if you will. Again, two leaders that are pretty much in control of society. They're not ruling absolutely. Again, they don't have absolute control. There's going to be, of course, in Rome, a certain aversion to kings. You know, they're not really going to want a king anymore because of their experience with the Etruscan kings. So they don't want an institution of kingship anymore. So they create a limited kind of leadership position called the two councils, and they're like the presidents, if you will, okay? And they're coming from the Senate. The Senate writes the laws. The Senate is pretty much in control of the aristocracy. The aristocrats, the large landowners, the wealthiest families are in control of the Senate. So this is the aristocratic part of the Roman Republic. The Senate, again, is made of the wealthiest males, the patricians. But over time, the Republic also created a legislative body for the masses. It was called the tribune. The tribune of the plebe. It was called the tribune of the plebe. Again, this is more like a legislative body for the masses. The masses are also going to have a say in legislation, writing laws. Of course, the Senate has to approve the legislation that the tribune, that represents the masses, the plebe as they were called, proposes. So it created a certain kind of balance, if you will, between the large landowners, the patricians, and the masses. The democratic part of the Republic was the tribune, in other words. And so there's a system of elections. Of course, the people are electing their senators, they're electing the members of the tribune as well, and the citizens participate. So again, the citizens are participating in politics, but they're not ruling directly. They have representatives, in other words, that are writing the laws for them. It's a representative form of government. Now, not all people participated in elections. There were, of course, women were excluded from participating in politics altogether, and of course, the slaves as well. So not everybody was included, again, in that system. So now, the Republic is going to go through a period of expansionism and imperialism. The city of Rome is going to start expanding, and it all started with the conquest of Italy. You know, from 370 to 264, the city of Rome is expanding north and south. You know, it's going to start building an empire, in other words. It all started with the conquest of the Latin League. You know, all the other Latin tribes will be conquered in central Italy by the Romans. They also conquered the Samnites. That's another ethnic group that live in the peninsula. And eventually, they're going to be moving into the south, conquering all the Greek cities that the Greek had established, very early on. The Greek colonies are going to also be conquered by the Romans as well. Now, the Romans are extending citizenship to many of the conquered populations. They're incorporating them into Rome, allowing them, in many cases, the right to vote. And while they were not doing that, they were simply building alliances with them as well. Okay, so they're not really just conquering them and forcing them to pay tribute the way other societies were doing, but rather they were incorporating them into the republic. Now, there was one very important tribute that those conquered societies needed to pay, and that is manpower. It's a military tribute. And this is one of the key factors that led the Romans to build a large war machine, is that all of the different groups that they were conquering needed to pay Rome tribute in terms of manpower. So Rome is going to have an inexhaustible source of manpower to continue waging wars, building their war machine, and sending their armies into other territories, conquering eventually the entire Italian peninsula. So by the 260s BC, Rome was in control of the Italian peninsula. And eventually, they're going to look into the sea as well, and they're going to clash with the major power of the Mediterranean, and that is the Phoenicians. Again, there's going to be a major confrontation that is going to produce a war otherwise known as the Punic Wars. The Punic Wars is, again, this is the conquest of the Mediterranean Ocean, if you will. Again, so the Romans are now looking into the outside. They're going to be looking into the Mediterranean Ocean. Again, so the Phoenicians have built a city-state which was really the kind of capital of the Phoenician Empire of the Mediterranean. It was called Carthage. Okay, Carthage. It was located in North Africa. Again, as you can see in this map, okay, in North Africa is the city of Carthage. And from Carthage, the Phoenicians built a large trading network in which they control resources, they control the imports and exports of luxury items. They were a mercantile empire per excellence. They had a very large fleet as well. They were a naval power, as a matter of fact. So again, there was a massive Phoenician expansion into the Mediterranean Ocean, and eventually two empires are going to clash. Again, in this case, the growing, emergent Roman Empire is going to clash with this Phoenician expansion, with the Phoenician Empire, with Carthage, again, with the city of Carthage. Now, so the Phoenicians, for example, at this point, are really building a very large empire. It's really a merchant empire based on trade and tribute. They are indeed controlling the trade in the Mediterranean Ocean, and also they're extracting tribute from all their provinces and colonies. They were able to build a very large naval fleet, the largest in this region, and they're ruled by very wealthy, merchants, as a matter of fact. Okay, so they are a society of merchants. They're very, very wealthy, and they are using their wealth to actually hire mercenaries to fight for them. So they're building a large army of mercenaries. Not to ignore, of course, the countless and countless North African tribes that are also falling under the influence of commercial influence of the Phoenicians, and they're also willing to fight for Carthage. So Carthage is really a power to reckon with. They're a mercantile empire, and they have a lot of resources, at least monetary resources, to confront a war with the Romans. And of course, this is going to start the very first war with the Romans. It will be known as the First Punic War from 264 to 241 BC. And the war started out over Sicily. Again, Sicily is going to be the spark of the First Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage. Again, this is an island, as you can see, that both Rome and Carthage claimed. Again, it was strategic for trade, and the Romans were willing and wishing to expand into this new region called Sicily, but it was claimed by the wealthy merchants of Carthage, and this is going to produce or set off a major conflict, again, that led, again, the two powers to confront each other on the high seas. Particularly, again, this is going to be the very first naval war of Rome. Again, Rome declares war on Carthage, but Rome was not a naval society. They didn't even have a fleet. So they seized one of the ships of the Phoenicians, and they started really copying the size and the structure of the ships, and they started building a naval fleet for themselves. Now, because they were inexperienced, during this war, Rome actually lost hundreds of ships on the high seas, not necessarily due to the warfare, but rather because of the sea storms. The Romans don't know much about the sea. So in many cases, they were walking, into the very middle of storms, and their entire fleet got destroyed again. So during this time, a Carthaginian general by the name of Hamilcar Barca, he's the one that actually captured Sicily. And at some point, of course, it seems that Carthage was winning the war. He got captured Sicily for Carthage. And just as the Phoenicians were claiming victory, back in Carthage, in the city of Carthage, there was a change of government. There's a new group, again, in Carthage that came into power. It's a wealthy merchant that decided that this war was very costly, and they were willing to actually give up the fight and let the Romans actually take control of Sicily. So they stopped the war, and they called quits, and Rome ended up annexing Sicily again. So they're pretty much expanding Rome into the Mediterranean. Sicily becomes the very first overseas province again. So this is really something that, for some reason, again, historians are trying to understand why is it that the Carthaginians actually gave up the island when they had already captured the island. So at some point, there will be a second confrontation between Rome and Carthage. This is known as the Second Punic War that spanned from 219 to 201 BC. Now, how that process took place? Well, Carthage at this point decided to expand west, not to confront Rome directly. They have given up actually all claims to Sicily. So they're now looking at the west. And they actually sent the general that actually captured Sicily in the First Punic War. He was sent to Spain, what is called the Iberian Peninsula. And Hamilcar, the general, actually colonizes Spain. And Spain is now part of Carthage. It's a new colony, if you will, of Carthage. All right. So during this incident, the son of Hamilcar, he had a son actually that he took with him. His name was Hannibal. He happened to be really, perhaps one of the greatest military geniuses of the ancient world, other than, of course, Alexander the Great. I mean, he was really, really skilled and a genius. While Hannibal, of course, was with his father in Spain, several things happened. Well, his father, first of all, died. Okay, so now he's in charge of all the forces of Spain on behalf of Carthage. Okay, Hannibal. But the Romans were also trying to expand westward as well, and they sent forces also to the Iberian Peninsula, and they clashed with Hannibal. So the clash in Spain between Hannibal and the Roman legions, again, over who's going to control Spain, set off the Second Punic Wars. Here, Rome and Carthage are not fighting over Sicily, they're actually fighting over Spain in this case again. So there's going to be now a major confrontation, which put actually Rome at the very brink of defeat. This is going to be the closest that Rome has ever going to be to actually total destruction and total defeat again. Hannibal is going to outmaneuver all the Roman legions. He's going to be defeating them. Even though he's outnumbered, he's going to be pretty much destroying the Roman forces, eventually marching into the Italian peninsula, as you can see. And the Roman forces were horrified, again, that they're now meeting a rival that they have never, ever even imagined in the past. They had no idea that such a massive force with a very brilliant general could actually inflict so much loss and defeat to the Roman army. Okay, so now, for example, in the Battle of Cannae, in the year 216 BC, the Romans in one day, in one afternoon, lost 65,000 soldiers. They were massacred. This is really horrifying for the Romans during this time. They were at the brink of defeat again. So Hannibal was taking, of course, his soldiers. He actually had an army of elephants. He was actually horrifying the Romans, in the Second Punic War. Now, during this time, the Romans come up with, of course, a solution. And the solution came in the form of nominating a new commander of the armed forces. His name was Scipio, Publius Cornelius Scipio. He also ended up to be very, very bright, very, very intelligent, a genius as well. And he's going to actually go to Spain and reconquer Spain. He's trying to force Hannibal out of the Italian peninsula, in other words. So he's pretty much regaining Spain, trying to force Hannibal out of Rome. And also, Scipio goes to North Africa, and he's going to be threatening Carthage more directly. So obviously, Hannibal is going to be recalled, so he will return back to North Africa. And that event, when Hannibal actually is recalled from Italy, this is going to be the beginning for the end of Carthage. There will be a major war between Scipio and Hannibal in 202, the Battle of Zama. Hannibal is defeated, and Rome ended up winning the Second Punic War. Again, so the outcomes of the Second Punic War is, this is the end of Carthage. This is the end of the Phoenician Empire. Again, Spain and North Africa are now Roman provinces. Rome ends up with a new Roman war machine, larger than ever before. And now Rome is dominating all of the Western Mediterranean. All of the Western Mediterranean, again, is now part of the Roman Empire. So they're expanding now after the Second Punic War. And because they have a massive army ready to march almost anywhere, they're going to be now looking east. They want to conquer the Eastern Mediterranean, the Hellenistic world. They're going to be conquering Greece and Asia Minor, those Hellenistic kingdoms. Once again, Scipio, the general, is going to be sent to Asia, and he's going to conquer the Greeks again. He's going to be known as Scipio Asiaticus, the great conqueror of Asia. And of course, the end result is that from this time onwards, now that Rome is controlling both the West and the Eastern Mediterranean, Rome is going to be now adopting many of the Greek cultural features and ideas. There's going to be a fusion of Greek culture, art, literature, religion, and of course, the Roman Empire will become incredibly wealthy as well. Incredibly wealthy again. This is really setting the stage for the end of the Roman Republic. Again, it's not officially an empire, it's still a republic, but this is really setting the stage for the end of the Roman Republic. Why is that? Well, because this growing imperialism, this expansionism of Rome across the Italian peninsula at the first, Sicily, and then, of course, Carthage, North Africa, Spain, and then, of course, the Eastern Mediterranean, Greece, and Asia Minor. Of course, this is going to start really creating a lot of turmoil and unrest and growing discontents within Rome. For example, the war veterans, a great many of them that actually sold their farms in order to go and fight the foreign wars to seek riches, when they came back from the wars, they ended up being poor and their farms were lost. So this gave rise to the great loss of family farms, for example. Second, a lot of the wealthy generals, they're coming back that have looted treasures, of course, and resources from their wars. They're coming back and they're using their wealth to buy those farms, the farms of the war veterans. And they're now creating large plantations. They're called latifundios, large landed estates where they're growing things like, for example, olive oil and fruits and other crops, for the market. So they're becoming a new elite, in other words. The old aristocracy resents the new landed elite, the wealthy, generals that are lavishing their wealth and buying land and controlling politics, in other words. And of course, the plantations, those latifundios, are now being worked by foreign slaves. The fact is that as Rome is expanding, they're also bringing slaves into Rome, and many of those slaves are being, used to work in the plantations. Instead of hiring, for example, the war veterans or the poor, in Rome, people are actually hiring slaves, in other words. They're not really hiring them, they're using them. In other words, as cheap labor. And with all this wealth, by this new elite, again, politics is now being corrupted again. They're buying votes, in the Senate, in the Tribune, etc., and they're controlling politics, the new elite, in other words. Now, given all this set of circumstances, the growing discontents, another aspect for the end of the Roman Republic is the fact that the ruling class was very, very determined not to change and introduce any kind of reform to alleviate the suffering of the people again. So there's a ruling class resistance to change. In what way? Well, for example, the grandsons of Scipio, the very wealthy general that conquered Carthage and the Eastern Mediterranean, they're called the Gracchus brothers. They actually tried to introduce reforms in order to alleviate social conditions. Their names was Tiberius Gracchus and Gaius Gracchus, again, from 133 to 123. Again, they tried to introduce something called welfare, disseminating or distributing grain to the poor so they can actually, have something to eat, so they don't live in the streets or they don't beg, and also to distribute land as well. Distribute land, break up some of those large latifundios, the landed estates, and give the land back, to the war veterans and to the people. And the Senate murdered them. Again, so they were actually murdered by the senators. They actually were enraged at the proposal of those laws, and they were actually murdered by them. So that proved that the Senate, that is now being controlled by this new rich group of people, the generals, are pretty much blocking all kind of change in Rome. Instead, what we see is that the ruling class is trying to distract, so to speak, the population from political matters by giving them what is called bread and circus, spectacles like gladiator games, for example, in which people are going to be offered drink and alcohol and some food at least once a week, and so they can be entertained, in other words, in order to kind of dissipate the social tensions and the social pressure that is already being felt, in Rome. So we see a major distraction. Of course, eventually there's going to be a major revolt. An actual slave by the name of Spartacus in the year 73 BC revolted against the Romans, and he led one of the largest slave revolts in human history. There were 5,000 or 6,000 people, a great many were slaves, that revolted against the Romans, and they all inflicted heavy losses as well on the Romans. Of course, Spartacus is going to be captured, and he's going to be crucified along with his 5,000 followers. Imagine 5,000 people being crucified again in Rome for revolting against the state. Now, of course, at some point, the wealthy generals that I just mentioned are going to take advantage of the situation in Rome, and they're going to, in many cases, seize power. They're going to become actually influential leaders in Rome, and they're going to start changing pretty much the character of Rome altogether. This is going to lead to the dictatorship eventually again. So there's a new pattern in Roman politics that the generals engaged in the conquest are coming back as heroes. Okay, people are praising them as heroes, as the saviors of society, and they're going to be elevated to celebrity status, like Scipio, for example, savior of Rome. He's expanding the empire, he's defeating our enemies, and they're going to become very wealthy, very respected, and also very influential in politics. Again, a great many of those are actually forming their own private armies. They're very popular, they're celebrities, so they have their own followers. In many cases, the war veterans are recruited to form their own private armies, and what they're doing is that they're using their private armies to engage in conquest, for glory, for fame, and power. And, when they come back to Rome, celebrated, and there's going to be big parades in the city of Rome, and they're going to be the new heroes, if you will. Again, so this is really changing the nature of Roman politics. People like Pompey, for example, he became a very popular war hero and general because he was fighting pirates. Pirates were threatening the Roman Empire. He subdued them with his private army and the resources that he was given by the state. And also he went to Egypt and also tried to conquer Egypt as well. So he's trying to expand the empire into new regions as well, in this case, Egypt. Again, so he was really, again, a very popular celebrity in Rome. Gaius Julius Caesar as well. He raises his own private army made up of war veterans, and he goes to Gaul, what is the nation of France today, and he engages in this massive campaign of conquest, decimating populations by the hundreds of thousands. And he's also, again, gaining a lot of reputation as to be ruthless. He's a conqueror. And again, he is really going to play a key role in the transformation of Roman societies, to the point that he's going to be recalled for his atrocities in Gaul. He's summoned back to Rome. He has to give up arms, and he gave up his army. And when he decided not to do that, there's going to be a major civil war in Rome. He's going to challenge the Senate for supremacy. And of course, there's going to be two people at war. The Senate is going to ask Pompey for assistance to combat the forces of Julius Caesar. There are now two personalities, two celebrities that are actually competing for the throne, if you will, for the control of Rome in this case. Now, Pompey is going to be defeated, and he's going to be murdered in Egypt. And with that, Julius Caesar is going to emerge as the only strong man, so to speak, that has the massive force, the loyalty of all the army under his command. And he's going to now institute what is called dictatorship, in other words. Now, Caesar is ruling the Roman Empire. He's actually granting his forces that are very loyal to him lands that he could conquer from other colonies. He's going to actually give lands to 80,000 veterans. Again, they're going to be seizing lands outside of Rome, across Europe, of course. He calls for emergency powers. He becomes dictator for life. He declared himself to be almost like a god as well, divine status. He antagonizes the Senate. He's fighting constantly with the senators, of course. He doesn't respect them, of course. And of course, there's a long-standing tradition in Rome against monarchies, of course, and kings. So, of course, the senators are going to come together and assassinate him in the year 44 BC, the assassination of Julius Caesar, because he's attempting to seize control of the state, become a king, and not follow traditions, in other words, of course. So now, this is really the end. This is the assassination of Julius Caesar really was the end of the Roman Republic. We from that point onwards, we're going to see the emergence of the empire, the Roman Empire. Again, we're going to see the rise of the very first emperor, in other words. And this is something that started out around 31 BC and spanned all the way to 455 AD. Now, how this process came about. Okay, so the first Roman emperor came about precisely in a time of tribulation for Rome. With the death of Julius Caesar, there was a vacuum of power. There was an absence of leadership in Rome, and there was a lot of strongmen that were trying to compete for power in Rome. There's civil wars, in other words, that was plaguing Rome during this time. Particularly, there are two men that have their own private armies: Mark Antony, Marcus Antonius, and Octavian. Octavian is actually the nephew of Julius Caesar. They're both trying to compete for this power to control Rome, in other words. So they pretty much are fighting far and wide across the Roman Empire. They ended up dividing the Roman Empire. Octavian controls the west part, and Mark Antony controls the eastern part. He actually makes an alliance with Egypt. he gets embroiled with a romance with the Queen of Egypt, Cleopatra, and Octavian, of course, rallies the masses in Rome saying that this is not really a civil war. This is a war with a foreign power, with fighting Egypt, in other words. Mark Antony has built an alliance with the Egyptians, and they're trying to conquer us. They're trying to change the capital from Rome to Egypt, in other words. So Octavian goes to Egypt, and he ends up conquering Egypt, and Mark Antony and Cleopatra, of course, are dead at the end of the day. They commit suicide, of course. So with that, with the defeat of Mark Antony, with the conquest of Egypt, now Octavian returns back to Rome, and once again, he's a strong man, he's a celebrity, and he's now elevated to become an emperor. Now, of course, this is not an official title. He understands that he cannot declare himself king of Rome. Okay, he's not a monarch, so he's going to rule as an emperor without actually claiming to be one, of course. So he's avoiding all kinds of kingly titles. He presents himself as being a humble, servant of the state. He, of course, still controls the Roman army, and this is really the central idea of the office of the emperor in Rome. Why people were emperors in Rome is because they control the army. So whoever controls the army is the emperor. So he's the supreme commander-chief of the armed forces, and that was really the power base, if you will, of the office of the emperor. Now, as far as the Senate, the two councils and the tribune, he said they can continue operating. Okay, you can still have a so-called a republic. In other words, the aristocracy is still going to control the Senate, the people are going to control the tribune, etc. So he's letting things run as usual, but now he's really on top, controlling the armed forces and controlling the empire again. So that is really the power base, the source of his power, the army. Okay, so he was really a master of propaganda. He was actually, building stories and myths and legends about himself, that he was the savior of Rome and so on, so that was also part of his success of building the very first office of the emperor. But after his death, the thing is that the next emperors, the next line of emperors, the way that the tradition was established by Octavius is that the male heir, so to speak, or a close family member is going to be chosen as the successor of the emperor. In other words, it's hereditary, in other words, succession. And it's going to be quite unfortunate, as we'll see, because a great many, again, of the heirs to the throne, so to speak, in Rome were not fit to rule. A great many of them were mentally ill, and this is going to be, of course, a catastrophe for Roman, politics and Roman society. Now, during the Age of Empire, Rome was spreading civilization across Europe. And not only Roman civilization, they were also spreading Greek civilization, the Greco-Roman civilization. Again, the golden age of the Roman Empire spanned from 96 to 180 AD. This is the age of the so-called the five good emperors, so to speak. This is a time when the emperors during this time were building cities far and wide across the empire, bringing the law of Rome all the way to Europe. So this is the first time that great portions of Europe got civilized, so to speak. There's a system of roads, canals, and of course, colosseums again. So there's a great civilizing project embarked upon by the five good emperors, as they were called. Again, you can see that almost every city, every province, every town, every community was linked to Rome. All roads lead to Rome. And again, those roads were protected by the Roman legions and so on. Merchants could actually travel back and forth. Trade, was conducted unobstructed, by anything. So this is a great time of economic and commercial growth. The Roman peace, as it was called. Now, at some point, of course, the Roman Empire is going to collapse. Again, there were several reasons for that. One had to do with corrupt leadership. As I mentioned, there were some rulers that were unfit to lead. Emperors such as Nero and Caligula that were mentally ill. They instituted a reign of terror. conducting political assassinations, assassinating citizens, assassinating senators, even their own families, again, family members, brothers, sisters, even their own parents will be assassinated, in other words. So again, the selective process of electing the wisest, if you will, ruler was not set in motion since Octavius ruled Rome as the first emperor. This first factor. So the second factor that is leading to the fall of Rome was the conversion of the Roman Empire to Christianity. Again, and this happened in the year 312 AD by the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great. So Christianity, of course, was a religion of compassion, brotherhood, serving other people, being humble and meek. And this is going to change, of course, the values of Rome, which was pretty much dominant, alpha male, dominating kind of society and culture. So instead of, conquering and dominating other people, with this shift towards Christianity, of course, the Roman culture is going to become more and more inward oriented, in other words. Now, the empire was also split in the year 395 AD. There's going to be a split of the Roman Empire between a western wing dominated by Rome and an eastern wing dominated by the city of Constantinople, because it had become so vast to administer, it was so difficult to administer, that it was decided to actually, partition and divide it and create two capital cities again. So this is also considered to be another critical moment for the fall of the Roman Empire, that was becoming too unmanageable, too great to manage, that it was actually partitioned and split in half, in other words. So that's another factor that some historians are looking at. And of course, the last factor is, of course, the barbarian invasions. There's still a lot of Indo-European groups known as barbarians by the Romans, because they were not civilized. So anybody that was not living in the Roman Empire was considered barbarian. Those were the Germanic tribes of Central Europe, like the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Goths, and the Vandals, for example. They lived, of course, on the edges, again, of the Roman Empire. And from time to time, they raided, Roman communities. But the Roman legions were always there, containing them and so on. Not successfully all the time, but, it was really keeping them at bay. Now, in the year 370 AD, there was a new group of people that came from Central Asia, otherwise known as the Huns. They invaded Eastern Europe, and that pushed the Germanic tribes, the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Goths, and Vandals, to now come more directly and invade the Roman Empire. So there's going to be now a series of Germanic invasions, including the Huns. The Huns will also invade Europe as well, and parts of the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire is going to be overwhelmed now. Again, they're going to be invaded from all fronts. The Vandals are seizing Spain and North Africa. The Visigoths are invading Rome in the year 410 AD. They invade the city of Rome. Eventually, the Vandals, this group that seized North Africa and Spain, came into the city of Rome in the year 455 and ransacked it, looted, and destroyed it almost entirely. Again, so Rome was destroyed again in the year 455. Again, it's a critical moment in Roman history. Again, that really was the end of the western wing of the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire in the west comes to an end in 455 as a result of those Germanic invasions, while the eastern wing, the center on Constantinople, is going to continue this new version of the Roman Empire called the Byzantine Empire, is going to continue for another 1,000 years until the year 1453 AD. Okay, 1453 AD. All right. So what we have covered so far, the summary points, are the major contributions of Greece and Rome to European civilization. We have covered is that the Greeks and the Romans introduced urbanism and the very first city-states in all of Europe. They were the first ones to build cities, in other words. They were the first ones to implement systems of government that were different from the monarchical systems of government elsewhere. things like, for example, democracy and republicanism. Athens introduced democracy and Rome republicanism. Massive public works, for example, temples, administrative buildings, theaters, colosseums, roads. Those were actually public works that those two civilizations embarked upon, and that created the very first, again, features of advanced civilizations in Europe. Again, also intellectual developments like natural science and philosophy, empiricism, the Ionian rationalists, for example, natural science, for example, rationality, ethics, Socrates and Plato introducing the, ethics, ethical values, in philosophy. Also, another, important contribution that we learn from Greece and Rome, again, is the fall of civilizations. Why Greek and Roman civilizations eventually collapsed, and they had to do particularly with two main, of course, factors. One was imperialism, the overexpansion, if you will, of those civilizations extended far and wide, created a lot of internal divisions, internal problems, eventually the corruption, of course, of those political systems that were governing the empires. And that led, of course, to the weakening of the empires, leading to the barbaric invasions that we just covered, like the Germanic invasions, for example. This is what we have covered, of course, in this topic. This is what we have learned regarding Greek and Roman civilization. This is all I have for you regarding this topic. When we come back, we're going to be looking now at Christianity and Islam, the imperial faiths. We're following on the timeline, of course, of world civilizations before 1500, and this is what we're going to be covering next after we come back. Thank you.